Hello and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And before we get started on today's episode, I'd like to take a moment to thank our audience for all of your support. Many of you have taken the time to rate and review us on iTunes, like our listeners, the Kidwells and Everyone's Lost But Me. These reviews help us keep the lights on and are much, much appreciated. Our special guests for today's episode are my colleagues here at the museum, Chrissy Gregg, Distance Learning Manager.
Hey Seth, thanks for having me.
Kim Geis, Curator.
Hi there.
And we're joined by Vanessa Schmid, Senior Research Curator for European Art at the New Orleans Museum of Art.
Hi Seth, thanks for having me.
Today we'll be discussing the 2014 film Monuments Men. The film centers on the story of American and British servicemen who are either recruited or assigned to a special unit that is designated by President Roosevelt himself to recover pieces of art that were stolen or plundered by the Nazis in Western Europe. Monuments Men stars George Clooney, Bill Murray, Matt Damon, John Goodman, Hugh Bonneville, and Cate Blanchett. The film was directed by George Clooney, written by Clooney, and Grant Heslov, and produced by, wait for it, George Clooney as well. It is loosely, very loosely, based off of the book entitled The Monuments Men by Robert Edsel. The film received mixed reviews upon its release. The one thing we do here, we always start with the first question, and Kim, I'm going to start with you. Is, in your opinion, how accurate is Monuments Men?
Well, you sort of set this up, I guess, in your intro. It's very loosely based on the book by Robert Edsel and very loosely based on the facts, I think, surrounding the Monuments Men. It is, fiction with some real facts sprinkled in, I think. So in terms of accuracy, there are some elements. So the artworks were, real, and actually in jeopardy at the time. The surroundings were mainly real, and the characters were based on real individuals. And I think we'll talk about this in a bit. So they were based on real individuals, but most of the details of those individuals were, differed in real life. Yes.
Yeah. Chrissy, what about you?
Yeah, I kind of struggle with this one too. But yeah, obviously they changed their names. They're based on people, but they changed their names maybe because they had the realization as the film too, as they were putting it together, that they're taking some liberties with their stories. But for me, unfortunately, with this film, I feel like they over-dramatize the wrong things and not really telling the real story that is both powerful and dramatic, or maybe they thought it wouldn't be as dramatic for film. So that's what I really struggle with there, is the things that they decide to really bring out. And we'll probably discuss that later in the podcast. And so it really doesn't show what those men and women were up against.
Vanessa, what's your opinion?
Well, I think Kim and Chrissy went through the relationship the movie had to the book, and changing of names, I'd say, and I probably will comment like this throughout our podcast today because I'm the resident art historian. So, comment, I think, more from that point of view. Firstly, ding ding, the representation of art historians is a little bit silly. You've either got an overly learned geek or a bit of a buffoon, but they also highly simplified kind of the way you talk about paintings or no paintings, and these artists. That said, of course, you have to do that for a wider public. But the other thing I would say is I think it was an interesting plot device. They chose very few artworks to focus on, right? They chose the Ghent altarpiece. They chose, of course, the Bruges, Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna, both extraordinary masterpieces. That said, when George Clooney is giving one of his monologues, these singular pieces are highlighted as the greatest masterworks of all time. And while they are great masterpieces, in some ways that oversimplification obfuscates the incredible wealth of all the other important objects that were potentially lost. And so, yeah, it was a plot device that I do think worked, but I felt could have been more nuanced.
So in the movie, they're seen, they being our 6 or 7 people here, are seen arriving in Europe in July of 1944, less than a month, or maybe a little bit more than a month, after the D-Day landings, after Operation Overlord. And there's an air in the film that the war is coming to an end. And now I think all of us here know that in July of 1944, first of all, the war was far from over, and second of all, it certainly wasn't a foregone conclusion that we were going to actually be victorious. It was thought, but nobody really knew for sure. What do you guys think about that? What's your opinion on that?
So I was checking this, and so George Stout, who's George Clooney's character is based off of, he did land on July 4th of 1944 in Normandy. But yeah, you're right. As we know at that time, I mean, the breakout from Normandy hadn't even really happened yet, And then I think the other thing that they don't really even discuss in this film because they don't have time is that there were monuments officers already in Italy as early as, I would think, mid to late 1943. So showing them arriving and that it's all, it's all coming to an end, yeah, is completely inaccurate, even if you just zero in on that one region of France,
I agree wholeheartedly. And it's actually, I did a little research for this bad book, because this is admittedly not my area of expertise, so I had to learn some stuff here. I found that they were actually formed in 1942 by the Brits in Libya, in North Africa. Yeah. That was the first, quote, monuments men. That's not what they were called, at least not then, but that's what they were, they were basically doing the same thing. And it was British archaeologist and Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Eric Mortimer Wheeler. That's a mouthful.
Quite a name, yeah.
Yeah, grew concerned that what remained of the Leptis Magna, which I have no earthly clue what that is an ancient Roman ruin in Libya, that much I do know, would be plundered and decimated in the midst of the war. So a unit was formed, which later became these people that this film was based off of. So they were actually operating quite earlier than that. And something else I found out, too, is that their initial task was not to rescue pieces of art, but it was to rescue statues and architecture.
And I think that's another thing that the movie really gets wrong is that it doesn't show that initial process of their work. They get to a site, they make an initial assessment at the potential damage of that structure or monument, whatever it may be, and then they make a report, and then they start to initiate the initial repairs if they're able to do so and kind of quarantine off the area. This really just shows the treasure hunty part of the Monuments Men, in the film, and they did do that too, and I guess that's more exciting, but I think the film totally skips that very important process of, all these important structures and these buildings that isn't mentioned in the film at all.
And I think this is Kim, and I think that kind of hints at what Vanessa was talking about earlier in the portrayal of the Monuments Men and women, which aren't really portrayed here at all, but portrayal as professionals. So we don't even really see them as professionals. They're just kind of, the art geeks, maybe. Like at one point they're like, "Oh, what's this piece? Oh, that's why I called you in here, because you would know, how to identify this work." Yeah. But it doesn't hint at, their real work or why they were called in necessarily to do this work. So I think.
Yeah, I agree. That's such a great point, Kim. Of course, that was. Chrissy, what were you saying? What did you give us in our notes? I think you had itemized, was it 345? The monuments
345 men and women from 14 different countries. So,
exactly. So yeah. Men and women, but the point is the international character, and that it was just widely assumed that you would protect cultural property. I mean, from my perspective, to watch this movie, that that these basic arguments had to be made to the president and a group that there was a reason to save cultural property. That was certainly not a basic assumption. So I think kind of over dramatizing that also serves to kind of belittle the value of cultural property at the same time, if you know what I mean. But and then of course emphasize the American character, right? Americans save the war, of course, and it's obviously all so complicated.
Well, I mean, I think too, in what you were saying about protecting cultural icons, statues, and things like that. I mean, that was something that wasn't just done in occupied or liberated Europe. I mean, in London during the Blitz, before the Blitz, even statues were sandbagged. They had like wooden and concrete structures built over them because they knew more than likely that London and the surrounding area was going to be bombed, and the Brits wanted to save these statues. The French did it too in Paris for certain pieces. Germans did it too.
Italians did it too. There's
Yeah.
like an
Of course,
awesome,
yeah.
photo of Michelangelo's David like in a cocoon, like bricked in, so they were all anticipating this happening,
Yeah.
or not.
It actually, and believe it or not, it actually happened here in the U.S. too. We have newsreel footage, I think it's in San Francisco, of them. I couldn't tell you what statues they are, but they're doing the same thing where they're basically blocking them off with wooden structures and then piling sandbags around them to hopefully shield them from theoretical Japanese bombs that, of course, never rained down on the city of San Francisco. So this is nothing new, but the whole creating a special task force to either document them or later, obviously, recover them or something like that, this was new. Mm-hmm. Am I right in saying this?
That would be my understanding. But then that also, and that certainly is in line with developments of what was going on. Actually, from what briefly I looked at about what the UN, and particularly UNESCO, which is the branch of the UN to cover cultural property, that my understanding is they were actually in a reaction to the rise of Hitler in the 30s, starting to discuss at these international bodies questions of protecting cultural heritage. But that, of course, wasn't finalized till later. But I think also what brings up this wonderful things that you were just mentioning of people preserving sculptures in public squares and other places is how many individuals were involved, and nameless, faceless people who wanted to be involved. I happen to know a lot about Amsterdam because that's where my focus of study in my field is. And when you think and reconstruct the effort to bring Rembrandt's Night Watch to miles and miles and miles away into the countryside, and the Germans did never get it, by the way. And those kind of faceless people, you felt like you didn't get to see any of them in the movie. Of course, the movie's about the Monuments Men, but, as in so many ways with war efforts, the ways in which individuals contribute.
No, well, I mean, no, you're very right. I mean, the movie is about these guys, but there were a lot of other faces in the crowd, if you will, that helped this work proceed even before the formation of such units such as this. In the film, and I'm going to go into my movie rant here. This is with a lot of George Clooney films. I think he fancies himself to be another reincarnation of Cary Grant, which he is certainly not. But he tends to be a little kind of silly, and there's some lighthearted comedy throughout this, throughout the movie, which I found kind of, distasteful, but that's just me. Was the work so often lighthearted as it's portrayed? And it's not everyone in the movie, obviously, but there are some scenes where, in particular, Matt Damon steps on a landmine, and it becomes a joke in a salt mine, and it's that's a bit obnoxious. But what's your opinion on this, Kim?
I mean, most of the cast, they are known for their comedic roles.
Mm-hmm.
So John Goodman, Bill Murray, Clooney.
Yeah.
Bob Balaban.
Yeah, right. So, yes, it was extremely lighthearted, and that scene with the landmine is, maybe one of the most egregious, I guess, instances of that where, you're probably not going to make a joke about whether or not, your architectural training, prepared you to help this, your colleague escape death. But there were some maybe out of place tender moments, like when they received the Christmas packages, and we hear the Christmas letter, and that was like a tender moment, but it did seem a little out of place amongst all of this, comedy. I don't know.
I think what they were trying to recreate, but honestly failed, is that throughout the Monuments Men book, there's a lot of letters that are exchanged between like family, the Monuments Men and women and their family members that are showcased in the book. And I think they were trying to do that there, but you're right, it felt weird, out of place, kind of. I don't know, maybe it was a little tender, but I also think it was kind of like, okay, let's keep going here, So maybe I'm not the sentimental type, but I think it was something they were trying to achieve that didn't quite, happen. So.
Well, we talked about this just briefly, but many of the characters in the film are loosely based on real people. And let's talk about three of them. Let's talk about the real Ronald Balfour versus Donald Jeffries in the movie. Who wants to take this one about Balfour?
I guess I'll talk about it. Yeah, I was digging a little bit because I found his story problematic, that he wanted to go back to Bruges to find Michelangelo's Madonna, and I remember being like, it was gone already. So, and indeed it was. By the time he got to Bruges, the Madonna wasn't there. And another problematic issue with that is it showed him. Because that was his favorite work of art as a boy, and going to that cathedral, that would be, the reason he would go there. But in fact, there was this long list of artifacts not artifacts, I'm in museum mode, but art and, paintings that they had already that they were going to try to figure out where they were. And it also shows him as like this former alcoholic looking for redemption, and the real man, the real Ronald Balfour was not that. I mean, everybody described him as a gentleman scholar and a good guy to work with. So, and then also the way he died wasn't in that sort of heroic way to try to save the Bruges Madonna from being taken by the Nazis. It's he died from shrapnel in his spine. So, which is I feel like more realistic. That's what happens in war. It's not like in this heroic effort. So, not to say that the man wasn't a good gentleman scholar, good man, but that's not the way it actually happened.
The actual portrayal of the actual man was probably more of a disservice to the actual person than a validation of him. I mean, I did a little bit of reading on him, but not a whole heck of a lot. But yeah, he was Cambridge educated. He was a fellow at King's College. I mean, this guy was highly, highly, highly educated man. He was a medieval scholar and historian, and you're right, he was killed by artillery. He was, or what one would assume to be artillery, So, I mean, it was a tragic death, but it wasn't nearly as Indiana Jones-ish as it was in the flick. What about, and I'll save the best for last, but what about Harry Ettlinger versus Sam Epstein? Harry Ettlinger he unfortunately passed away in 2018. He was the last surviving Monuments Man of the original, crew here that we're referring to. The museum has an oral history of him, which you will hear on the minisode next week. But what about Ettlinger? Can anybody talk about him?
I think Ettlinger might be the figure that's maybe closest to his character in the film, Sam Epstein, so Ettlinger was born in Germany. He actually, I think, had the last bar mitzvah in Karlsruhe before he and his family were forced to leave.
They got out in the late 20s, didn't they, or the early 30s?
I think in the 30s.
Okay.
30s, yeah, I think I just saw that. Yeah.
And he, so he went into the U.S. Army and was not in service of the MFAA originally. but ended up, being utilized by that outfit. So, all of those things are kind of similar. His family did have some artworks that his grandfather did manage to hide. And I was just reviewing details of Ettlinger's story, our oral history, so stay tuned for that in the mini episode. But yeah, so there were some elements, but I believe Ettlinger's extended family mainly did manage to flee.
Yeah.
So, that part of Epstein's story, I think, was tweaked a little bit, but also very realistic to many, I think, new American Jewish soldiers.
Yeah, he was almost kind of there by happenstance, really. The way the real Edlinger. I'm talking about, not the character, because he was kind of thrown into the situation. He volunteered for the MFAA because he was actually an infantry replacement after the Bulge, and he was pulled before he ever got to the 99th, and I'm spoiling next week's episode, but before he got to the 99th, he was pulled out because now this is, I think, January, maybe February 45.
I think it's February.
You'll find out next week. But he was assigned as a interpreter for the Nuremberg trials that everybody knew. Well, they weren't called Nuremberg trials, but that's what became. And then he volunteered for this service. But he was kind of a hanger-on. I mean, I shouldn't say that. He wasn't a hanger-on, but he was kind of on the periph, and he got to see all this stuff.
He wasn't brought in for his art expertise.
No, not
he was
at
brought
all.
in to be a translator.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
but he got to see all this
different.
stuff go down. He was in Neuschwanstein. He was in one of the salt mines. He saw all these, the discoveries. He was there, which is really, really cool. Now, in the movie, Claire Simon is supposed to be Rose Valland, and this is Cate Blanchett's character. Chrissy, I can see you grinning over there. Let her rip.
Well, I don't think the whole idea of this pseudo love story between Matt Damon's character and Rose Valland's character, or Claire Simon, Cate Blanchett's character, is frustrating. And every time I think about that film, that's the top of my mind. That just is distracting to how amazing of a woman she was and the things that she did. At the Jeu de Paume, and I think they show her tenacity to a point, but it, I think, is only, a sliver of what this woman accomplished and everything that she achieved, and taking down copious notes of what the Germans were doing at that repository. So that's kind of my biggest frustration. I'll stop there. I'll let other people chime in.
It was there had to be a love story. So how are we going to fit a love story into this? Otherwise,
it doesn't. Yeah, it's we don't need this. You know what I mean? Why does, just because you have one woman in this whole thing, you have to manufacture a love story?
But but is it? I mean, he rejects her in some manner that I felt was also aggravating in terms of the strong female character that the opportunity for a strong female character that was a little bit lost. But and they did hint at it when you had the first scene, that wonderful scene that is actually really impactful when Stahl is walking in and all those paintings are lined up for him. And she's kind of standing there. I feel like that was the only suggestion you had, that she was a collaborator. But I mean, apparently the deception and the ways in which she went about doing, I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary, the secrecy. So there are ways they could have hinted and brought that out more, because it's such a remarkable, remarkable story.
She was an extraordinary woman anyway. I mean, she, as we've kind of hinted around, she was essentially a spy. I mean, for all intents and purposes. I mean, she was writing down, taking, as you said, took, meticulous notes of what was there and who was there to see them and where they were being shipped off to and all this other stuff. And she handed them over to the French Resistance. Now, in a previous episode, I talked about the French Resistance for good or bad. And, I mean, this is one thing that is very, very true. And, she was doing this at the risk of her own life.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, even something as, if you really want to be honest about it, telling people where art is going as compared to troop movements prior to the invasion, one is a little more serious than the other. But either way, Had she been caught, she'd have been killed. She'd have been tortured and killed, no doubt. No doubt the Gestapo would have gotten a hold of her.
Especially because that was the main it's like number one, if it's the primo stuff, it's going to the Linz Museum. If it's the next tier, it's going to Goering. So it's still involving these high level, or the highest level.
Yeah, Goering.
And the other thing I want to bring up as well about Rose Valland, that, I know they don't have time to get into her backstory, but she's doing this all unpaid. She was a volunteer at like the Jeu de Paume for like a decade, not receiving much compensation for her work there. And that, if you're come from a wealthier, like Parisian or French family, and you can do that for some time, that's one thing. But she came from like a very, I think, like low to middle class.
A blacksmith.
Like family, and she still sacrificed, wages and potentially her life, for this art because she cared that much. So I think that's unbelievable.
She was pretty cool. Vanessa, you wanted to talk about somebody.
Well, I thought we'd just, connect from talking about Rose to talk about the character James Grange, played by Matt Damon, versus James J. Rorimer. And again, as the resident art historian. So Rorimer, Rorimer was the curator of medieval art at the Met. He becomes an absolute vital force to the development of the medieval collections, related to all of the work he did in various parts of Europe, but also, if you know, the Cloisters Museum in New York, which is this outstanding auxiliary of the Met on the big hill in the north of Manhattan Island, which is extraordinary. Basically, it's a reconstructed pastiche of different cloisters to represent a medieval monastery from Europe. And that was spearheaded by Rorimer, working along with one of the Rockefellers to make that happen. And in fact, there's a lot of there's a lot of shady deals and things. I mean, it's not shady. Nothing was coming out of Europe illegally, but a lot of those things also came from things that, of course, were being destroyed in the process, and then became pastiches. So anyway, it's a really he was this wonderful force, and I feel like the Matt Damon character doesn't have that. It's he's kind of bumbling. He's his
French is terrible. That
yeah,
whole shtick.
and
It's
so
like,
I think that's a shame. Rorimer was clearly a complicated character and somebody who was extremely powerful and convincing, but also a great scholar. So I just thought that's kind of an interesting element to think about too, of what Rorimer became and how this experience absolutely must have shaped what then became one of America's greatest projects of medieval art, which is the cloisters.
Very, very cool. Chrissy, you kind of touched on this, and we'll go over this really briefly. The prioritization of what artwork is the most precious is depicted more around motivation, childhood memories and redemption, that kind of thing. And it's for anybody to answer, please chime in. How were the priorities of these missions actually set?
Well, I'll maybe start with the early days. I think before you had the MFAA in existence, you had these prior commission, like the Roberts Commission, and before that it was like these other different groups that were, as I said, compiling these lists of things that might be threatened in this impending war. And so they had those lists to go on. And to my understanding, I think that's what determined, when they went over there, they at least would go check on these things that were on this initial list that they composed. That's my basic.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that isn't discussed so much in this film, but also I watched the 1964 Burt Lancaster vehicle, The Train, which was based on Rose Valland's book about the transportation of artwork from the Jeu de Paume into Germany. And not recommended, really. 2 hours of kind of,
of your time wasted.
I'll stop taking my notes here. Okay.
As a French train engineer. But there was a lot of focus on the value of the artwork, the monetary value, and that importance in terms of war finance, I suppose. There were lots of quotes like "money is a weapon" and things like that. But you do see that a bit in terms of the looting of other cultural property and and the gold, of course.
Yeah,
That's
because they're not even cultural property, but personal property.
personal property. Yes, of course.
And body parts, fillings.
And so I think that does come into play with some of the artwork. They were culturally very significant, but they were also extremely valuable.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's no secret that the Third Reich was, especially towards the end, even though they had all this quote Nazi gold, that's sunken in lakes, but they were hurting for cash. They really were. They were hurting for cash. They were hurting for money, and this looting of art actually did play a role in that. Vanessa, you were going to say something?
Well, I was, but then you just brought something up interesting. So do you think already at this moment the idea that there's an element of art as commodity and it could be liquidated for actual cash? Because I think of that something much more recent and now that we really think about that. And
I mean, it was known that this stuff was valuable, but I mean, the overall purpose of maybe not all of the thievery, but a great deal of it was to put into, and that's something I was going to talk about here in just a few minutes, was to put into the Führer Museum, the planned Führer Museum in Linz, Austria. That of course obviously never occurred, but thank God. But
which is where I think starting with the question, right? This particular question of how the emotional value for these individual characters is kind of driving the plot, which just completely misses the opportunity to really concretize the ways in which art is interchangeable with power, the possession of art. What does it mean to possess cultural property and to be in that possession, right? Why was the Führer Museum important? It's not just because Hitler is a failed art student. That's absolutely beside the point.
Yeah.
although I think it played a part in it. His whole. I'm not saying that was
His
sole reason.
maniacal, sure.
Oh yeah, well that and his megalomania. I think. And this is just me hypothesizing here. I don't know. I never got into Uncle Addie's head. Never really wanted to. But, the whole establishment of a Führer Museum, think about the name for crying out loud. In Linz, which is where he grew up, or spent a great deal of his time anyway as a child, where he was rejected for art school
Salzburg.
in it Salzburg or Vienna?
Maybe it's Vienna.
Either way,
Austria.
as you said, he was a rejected, a failed artist, frustrated artist, and I think it was a thing to show people, hey, look what I did. I didn't get into art school, but look at my collection now. And maybe not, but that's just my take on it anyway. So that brings us to the point of the Altsee salt mine. And that's probably one of the more, that and maybe Neuschwanstein are two of the more famous stashes, if you will, of art. Does anybody want to talk about how accurate is the drama that's shown in the movie at the salt mine, and as compared to reality? Y'all take it, go for it.
Well, maybe I'll start and Kim can continue, but so they kind of put the drama in the wrong places. So that's what I was saying kind of in the beginning of the show here is that, they were under threat from the Russians coming in at any moment. And that wasn't the case at that salt mine. I think in Merkers, they were in the future Russian zone of occupation, but not at Altsee. And so what was really crazy was that the Gauleiter of that region took that Nero decree, which I know we'll maybe talk about later, but took that to heart and destroying everything. The Nero decree doesn't say specifically destroy art, but so he was going to blow the whole mine. The miners of that town were like, we don't want to see our livelihood destroyed, so they only put a palsy in the mine to only blow up the entrances, and so that what's inside couldn't be accessed. So it stopped the crazy regional governor from doing that, but it wasn't really necessarily, I don't think, to save the art. It was just to preserve their way of life post-war and their livelihood. And so it doesn't really show, again, I know that's not the Monuments Men story, but that story is crazy, and it doesn't really show it. And then it doesn't show, in some ways, how insane it was to get the artwork out of the mines with 137 tunnels. And they had to build, specialty elevators and all this, it was insane.
Go ahead, Kim. And I was going to say the Germans had been planning that for a very, very long time. I was reading this morning that they started. I mean, the salt mine had been there for hundreds of years, and they obviously knew about it. They'd actually been planning to store and started. So they had actually started storing looted artwork in there in 1943. So it was nothing new. You know, they built, as you said, they built elevators. They built special shelves and racks on the walls and things in the walls. Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, the walls of the tunnel caves to hang these artwork, pieces of art in there and to store them. So, I mean, this is a long-term project. This wasn't something that was done willy-nilly. And the actual American officer who discovered this, well, who was a major part of this operation, was a guy named George Stout, who they say also was part of Clooney's character, and he was the actual CO of commanding officer of this unit. I took these notes here a little while ago. When he arrived at the mine, he noted, dig this, 6,577 paintings. That's just paintings. 2,300 drawings or watercolors, 954 prints, 137 pieces of sculpture, 129 pieces of arms and armor, 79 baskets of objects. What the hell those objects were, I have no idea. 484 cases of objects thought to be archives, 78 pieces of furniture, 122 tapestries, and 12 to 1,700 cases apparently of books or similar items, and 283 cases, contents completely unknown. That is a lot of stuff. You can't move that in a couple of months. I'm sorry. I mean, that takes a long time.
Just inventorying those numbers.
I was going to say, just
Right?
inventorying. So as someone in the museum field who occasionally
curators
catalogs material, that is frightening.
Yeah.
And these chambers were more than like a mile deep inside this mountain. I mean, they were way down in there.
Well, and that intentional nature, as you say, they were organizing these spaces to be repositories for art, and that was something that I think is a fascinating feature of also why how much of the recovered art is in good condition. Of course, it's a tragedy how much was lost, but there's the reverse story that is just as interesting. Why did so much survive? Partly, of course, because of some of the more durable materials. The Ghent altarpiece, which is the focus, is of course a work on wood panel. And while wood as an organic substance is very reactive to temperature or humidity, of course, it is in fact extraordinarily durable, which was why it was used by artists in the first place. It's meant to survive as an object of worship for in perpetuity. So anyway, but so that that intentionality I think is really remarkable, and in some ways that's actually something that's well depicted in the movie in terms of the art storage, the organization. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Definitely, they do a great job of just impressing you with the kind of density and like numbers of things, right? That's something that a movie can do well, right? Visually, you just kind of get that impact immediately.
Yeah, it's visually rich in certain areas too, and I feel like when they flip the switch on all the Nazi gold and Merkers, there's a photo that looks very similar to that I had in my mind. It was like, oh, so they do. They're okay. It's okay in some in that regard with some of those things, yeah.
Well, we talked about it briefly. The Soviets. Soviets are being around the corner. Got to get the art. Got to get the art out of there for the commies come. And in some way, as you said, Chrissy, they were in future zones of Russian occupation, but not at that time. This is going to be mid to late May 45, and if I'm incorrect here, please somebody correct me, but I don't think the Russians or the Soviets rather, would be the more appropriate term, took over that zone of occupation until like July or August. So it wasn't, everybody bust your backs and get this thing out of here right now because the Russians are down the road. It was, they wanted to get it out of there, but it wasn't, at such a frenetic pace as was shown in the film. Why is it so prevalent? And this goes even into today. So this is one thing we generally don't do is talk about what's going on today in this podcast, but in this application we can. Why is it so prevalent for invading armies or occupying armies, whatever it may be, to destroy art and other cultural markers? Why do you guys, what's your opinion on that?
To destroy or to loot? Like, what do you?
Either or.
Yeah.
Either or.
Because I feel like they have different purposes. We don't. Maybe we'll get into this, but obviously with the looting of like prominent Jewish families in France specifically, but really everywhere across Europe. I mean, we know the intent for that is to erase, who they are as people. And then looting it brings up Vanessa, your question again of what is art a commodity? Does art display power? What is the purpose of art to these, occupiers or these, armies coming in? And so I don't know. I mean, those are really big questions, but I feel like those are the intents of looting and destroying are very different things,
Yeah, looting is taking, right? And it's about possession, right? Napoleon coming back. Sorry, I'm mixing time periods.
Rock and roll, man. Take it.
Napoleon coming back from Egypt and putting an obelisk in the middle of Paris. That's possession. I did this. Destruction, right? Like ISIS destroying Buddhist monuments. That is erasing, right? Nonetheless, of course, it's using symbols to accentuate power and is the bottom line.
I think, for armies, and I mean all armies do this. It wasn't just the Germans that looted things. The United States Army did the same damn thing in World War II. Often. And I'm not just talking about, looting Nazi paraphernalia from dead soldiers or prisoners of war. I'm talking about going into German houses and just, literally cleaning out the silverware. And I mean, that's what that is. It's looting, it's theft. And it is what it is. But I mean, armies have done this throughout time. It's just not to make it right or wrong, but it's the spoils of war. It's something that they do. It's something that armies do. And I think, as you were saying, Vanessa, it's a show of power. It's like, we conquered this land and look what we brought back. I mean, for crying out loud, it's in the Bible, for God's sakes. When Moses and what's Ramses or whatever brings in the conquered peoples, and he brings in the furs and the silks and all this other stuff. I mean, it's all there. I mean, goes back to ancient times. So this is nothing new, but the destruction of art and cultural icons is, I think, as you said again, Vanessa, I think that's more of a thing of, and Chrissy, is a destruction of a people's history, and that's clearly what was done in terms of the Jews in Europe when the Germans would essentially just, there's a line in Schindler's List when Amon Goeth says that for 600 years the Jews ruled Krakow, and after tonight those 600 years are a rumor. So, I mean, granted, this is coming from another film, but I mean, it's based on the same thing. They're destroying any kind of remembrance and history of these people.
Erasure, yeah.
Yeah, it's a better term. Yeah.
I also think this is where the film is, I don't want to say it's strongest, but they were trying to make that point. There's that moment where George Clooney's character is, sending the message over the radio about, like, how important their job is. And, he says something along those lines, is that, we are ensuring that these cultures that make us human will continue. Like, we are not human without arts and culture, and that's, one of the many things, and in some ways maybe some of the most important things that define us as people. So, I mean, I'm glad that point was made in the film. I don't know. Again, the film, I don't think maybe always does a good job at really illustrating that. But it's nice at least it was said. So.
Well, we're not really talking about the film here. We're just talking about history.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. We're going to have to move on because we're taking up a lot more time than I thought we would on this bad boy. I'm going to skip
talk
over.
for hours, Seth. I'm ready.
I can see that. I'm proud of you. You're doing very well. We're going to skip to a couple ones down the line here. Let's talk about Russia. Or again, I keep saying Russia, and that's incorrect. It's the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union as a secondary villain in here, and the whole busting our humps to get this stuff out the cave, out the mine. What's the whole approach? What was the Soviet Army's, the Red Army's approach to artwork?
I think that was about money. Or restitution. So it was seen as a
I'd say it's revenge.
Or revenge,
reparations.
perhaps.
Yeah, revenge. But.
And I also think I saw too somewhere some stats in my notes that the German military looted and destroyed like 240 40 like art museums and cultural institutions on the Eastern Front. So in some ways, it's like, well, if you destroy our stuff, well, you'll still destroy your stuff. You know what I mean? And we're going to take your stuff.
Well, I mean,
So-
the Soviets were in honesty, and this is the historian coming out here, the Soviets were no different than the Nazi. They weren't. They were not. And, I mean, they killed more people than the Germans ever wished they could have. And their looting of German art, or art that the Germans might have had in their possession, whether it was German art or French art or any kind of art, it was done, in my opinion, under the same pretense as the Germans doing the same thing, because Stalin wanted to get his hands on it for power, for money, for revenge, whatever it may be. And it was well, look what I got now kind of a thing. But that's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it.
But again, in the film, it comes off as kind of silly, I think.
Yeah.
It does, but
Tit for tat.
It is, and it does come across as silly. I agree with you, and it's unnecessary, and it's not accurate. It's not accurate at all. But the whole theory behind that is we don't want the Russians to get it, because if they get it, nobody will ever see this stuff again. That is pretty damn close to the truth. In all honesty, it really is. But how they did it? Say again.
The lack of transparency of the ownership of cultural objects remains a major issue.
Yeah.
In fact,
Yeah.
in terms of what is itemized and what is not in the Russian satellites versus the rest of the Western world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they did get a lot of stuff, for sure. Well, Chrissy, can you, or anybody here at the table, can you discuss some of the artworks that are still considered missing? Some of the more famous ones?
Just talk about a couple of them. The Monuments Men Foundation has actually a nice little list on their website if anybody's curious. But I think the one they show in the film that we could talk about is there's this famous Raphael that you see. I guess the Germans are burning with the Nero decree or something, and so that is actually one of the more prominent ones on that list. But there's Botticelli's, there's Caravaggio's. I mean, there's some very prominent artists on there.
There's Van Gogh, too, isn't there?
I believe so, yeah. I'll have to actually look at that list a little more thoroughly myself. But and they're missing, or their last known location. I mean, they're various. They're spread throughout Italy and Germany and Western Europe. So there's still the hunt for them. I know the Monuments Men Foundation they've found or returned 30 works of art, they've said at this point, through their research efforts.
And didn't they, I was doing some reading, and didn't they also return some works of art that were, quote, liberated, unquote, by American soldiers from German museums?
Yeah, so
or houses?
Yeah, I think I think there's some work, even, within the United States of what, as you brought up, like everybody takes.
does it.
So,
Doesn't make it right, but everybody does it.
Including in this country.
That's
so.
right. Well,
Well, I think, Chrissy, one of the things you touched on, of course, is the Monuments Men Foundation website. And and of course, that's about, tracing works that were lost. And certainly in the intervening 60 years, there's been extraordinary efforts and extraordinary developments in what is called provenance research. Provenance meaning the history of ownership. And there is something called the Art Loss Register that is very active. It was founded in 1969, and they do really important work about making these questions visible. And that's something where the internet really, really helps. So if something's been stolen, if a dealer is trying to traffic in something like that, and I think those are just extremely important efforts that, of course, came out of these basic impetus in World War II. And I should say, as museum professionals, we know that now this is an important part of our job too. Is justifying how and why you got something. Which is, of course, important for other non-Western cultures or cultures that were, in upheaval in Africa and so on. And so that accountability is really important.
we'll wrap it up here, Kim, and I'll start with you. Did you like this film? Did you like Monuments Men, and would you recommend it? Be honest.
No, I'm sorry, no. I did not like the film. Although I wanted to. I really wanted to. As someone who, specializes in the period, as someone who loves many of the actors in the film, I wanted to really like it. Shout out John Goodman, But I'm afraid, no.
Chrissy?
I feel similarly. It's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart in a lot of ways, and the movie just doesn't really deliver, and it comes off as very dull about something that is, I think, quite the opposite. I mean, the only thing, my biggest beef with the film is that I don't know if it should have even been created, because I think there are other mediums to tell this story in a more proper way than the way that it was told, on camera. So, yeah, no.
Vanessa, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I third, what Kim and Chrissy say, that in terms of not delivering, but also it just felt kind of hokey. And I think what's interesting is that throughout our conversation here, now I've come to think more about this jokiness and this lightheartedness, and to feel that it's unfitting. And it's interesting how you can have a conversation like this and come to new ideas. But I also, I think it's important to look at the bright side of things, not the bright side, but to offer some positives. And we all are museum professionals and understand what it means and how important it is to introduce as broad an audience as possible to basic questions. And certainly a kind of Hollywood production that valorizes cultural heritage as an endeavor that should be preserved as a concept, and think that things should be preserved in the public trust. I think we're probably all for that. But anyway, I don't mean to be pedantic, but I do think we have enough action in Hollywood movies that don't put forth sometimes basic ideas of substance, and that you have that. And then as an objects person who deals with artworks and really questions of materiality and materials, one of the things that really struck me when I saw the movie last night, re-revising from whenever I saw it first, is how in the digital age we have really lost the question of the uniqueness of one object created by one person across space and time. Instagram, we've lost that. And I think to be able to emphasize, even here, maybe it's emotional, maybe, we don't love the way it's presented, but that absolutely the question of craftsmanship, the expression of ideas in unique and singular objects is so vital. I just think to young generations that now don't have that feeling.
Well, that's very hard to follow up
on. I know. I'm like, wow.
Damn.
You asked me to think about it.
This is why you are here.
You asked me to think about it.
Did I like it? No. Would I recommend it? No. Like you guys, like everybody here, I think the actual story is really cool. It is neat, I mean, the whole preservation of these valuable pieces, and the whole act of getting to them, where they were located, how they found them in reality, not in the movie, in reality, is cool. It's a neat story, and I mean, they did preserve art for these pieces of art for millions upon millions of people to see for God knows how long. But I mean, as far as the movie is concerned, looking at it I'm a military historian. I talk about combat. I talk about battles. I don't talk about art. Nothing against art. I have an appreciation for it. But that's just not my thing. That's not what I went to school to do. And in that regard, looking at this movie, I think it sucked. I'll be perfectly honest with you. Cut and dry. I thought the selection of the actors it left a lot to be desired.
We didn't even talk about their ages. Oh,
no,
God.
We didn't, and let's just not, because that's another conversation that would take up another 15 or 20
Oh, wait,
minutes.
I had wanted to ask you, the costumes, are those historically accurate?
Yeah, they actually did look pretty good, even though that John Goodman's helmet looked like a bottle cap on top of his head. But, that's what you get. So no, I wouldn't recommend the movie. I'd recommend the book. Check out the book, but not the flick. Kim, final thoughts.
I mean, I think it was mainly a vehicle for the stars to, make a vanity project, perhaps. I don't know, make this film together.
Ocean's 14, maybe?
Yeah. But it does bring forth, like Vanessa said, it did sort of bring this into the spotlight.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Chrissy?
Yeah, Vanessa's positive words maybe inspired me too, but that idea that, this is something that we, need to preserve and continue to preserve, and even bringing it to modern conflicts today. If people are even, just your general public is even thinking about that, well, that's, I think, a step in the right direction. So if the movie did that, well, that's a nice thing.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I agree with those final thoughts. And I know you do this podcast series, and I just time and again learn what a pleasure it is to cross these boundaries. I've come from City Park to see you at the World War II Museum, and I really appreciate the situating this within the context of World War II. Thanks a lot.
Well, glad you were here. My final thoughts are this. Like as I said, if you really want to know the story of what these people did and the importance of what they did, go to your library or look it up on Amazon and find the books that will actually talk about it. And I think there's a couple documentaries too. And forgive me, but I don't recall the names.
The Rape of Europa.
There you go.
Good.
The book is very good.
It's far better than this film. So with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week when we discuss this topic again in our minisode. We will return a week after that to discuss the 1977 epic A Bridge Too Far. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible. Our producer, Tessa Jager, and Music Shed Studios here in New Orleans. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.